At 80 years old, she was still cleaning classrooms, quietly, faithfully, without ever asking for recognition. Students walked past her. Teachers barely knew her name. But when Denzel Washington walked back into his old high school and saw her still working, everything stopped. What he did next didn't just change her life, it changed the way an entire school saw itself. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, about justice, dignity, and people who lift others in silence, hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel. You're going to want to stay for this one. Mount Vernon wasn't the same, but maybe it was Denzel who had changed. As he stepped out of the black car, the crisp morning air brushed against his face, laced with the scent of damp leaves and old asphalt. The facade of his old high school looked smaller now, almost shy, yet still standing like a silent witness to the roots of who he had become. He lingered at the gate, not as a celebrity, but as a student seeking permission to step back into a story that never quite let him go. The main hallway was quiet, broken only by the soft echo of his footsteps. Fluorescent lights flickered above, and faded posters from long-past school events still clung to the corkboards. He ran his fingers over one of them, and in that brief touch he felt the weight of another life. The quiet kid in the back of the class, that was him. The one who never raised his hand, but absorbed everything. His eyes searched instinctively for familiar faces, but what he was truly looking for was a presence, the kind that never sat front row, but always lingered nearby. Denzel moved through the corridors as if every door held a whisper. The old drama room still had the crooked plaque above the door. He reached for the handle but didn't go in. Instead, his feet pulled him toward the auditorium, the real sanctuary. That's where he used to rehearse lines no one cared to hear. Where he sat beneath a worn-out blanket between rows of empty seats, teaching himself how to exist out loud. And every now and then, far in the back, there was a still figure, quiet, unseen, always watching. He pushed the auditorium door open. The creak hadn't changed. Neither had the smell, dust, aged wood, and something deeply emotional you couldn't quite name. He stepped onto the stage slowly. Sat at the edge, feet swinging just like he did when the future was a question mark. He scanned the empty rows, seeing not emptiness, but echoes of moments when he almost gave up. That place wasn't just a stage, it was a mirror. And behind every mirror, someone had stood guard without ever asking for credit. He knew who that presence was, not a teacher, not a principal. A woman in a blue uniform, soft footsteps, calloused hands, someone who unlocked doors after hours, who left a blanket on the corner bench. No one else saw her, but he did. And that's why he was back. Not to relive what once was, but to find someone who never really left him. Because there's a kind of gratitude no trophy can repay, a debt that success never clears. He wasn't even sure if she was still alive. Maybe she had retired, maybe not. But something inside told him that if she was still around, she wouldn't be behind a podium. She'd be pushing a cart, wiping down stairs, sweeping away memories no one else thought to keep. And if that were true, then this wasn't just a trip down memory lane. This was the beginning of something he still needed to do. The hallway leading to the administrative wing looked cleaner than the rest of the school, polished to a quiet shine like someone took pride in the little things others overlooked. Denzel slowed his pace, sensing something familiar in the air. The scent of lemon-scented cleaner lingered faintly, blending with the dusty undertone of old buildings. That smell, that rhythm, that energy. He turned a corner and stopped. Just ahead, a slender woman in a blue uniform pushed a janitor's cart with calm, steady hands. Her posture was slightly curved with age, but her steps still carried intention. And in that moment, time folded in on itself. 80 years old, and she was still working. Her grey hair was coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. Her shoes, practical and worn, squeaked softly with each movement. Her hands, weathered by decades of labor, moved with a quiet grace, sorting rags and sprays, as if arranging a sacred ritual. Denzel froze, throat tightening. The years had deepened the lines around her mouth and eyes, but the energy, the energy was unmistakable. Mrs. Eloise Brooks. The woman who kept doors open long after hours, who turned off the alarms so a shy boy could rehearse monologues into the silence, who never once asked for thanks. He didn't say a word, just watched her, absorbing every detail like a man witnessing a miracle. She was humming something faint, a church melody maybe. Her head nodded slightly in rhythm as she sprayed the glass of a trophy case that no longer held his picture, and when she turned, just slightly, she caught his reflection in the glass. Her hand stopped mid-motion. Her eyes locked on his, wide but calm, like she had been waiting all this time for this exact moment. A breath left her lips. "Well, I'll be damned." They stood still, seconds that felt like whole chapters passing, and then he moved, slowly, reverently, closing the space between them. She stepped forward, no hesitation, and wrapped her arms around him. No words. Just warmth. Familiar. Fierce. Full. He held her tight, burying his face in her shoulder like a son who had found his way home. She smelled of lavender and floor wax, and under that of safety. The kind you never forget even when the world changes around you. When they finally pulled apart, she cupped his face, her fingers calloused, trembling slightly. "I knew you'd come back here one day," she said, voice husky but clear. "You had that kind of soul." Denzel laughed, but his eyes were wet. "You were the only person who ever saw it." She shook her head gently. "Oh no, baby. I didn't just see it. I helped clean the path for it." Her laugh came through then, dry, full of pride. "Though I still remember the day you froze on stage and nearly ran off crying. Had to pretend I was mopping the floor just to give you cover. That broke the tension." They both laughed, real unfiltered laughter, and in that moment the years between them vanished. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and looked her in the eyes. "Dinner. Tonight. Just us. I need to say some things I should have said a long time ago." She hesitated as if to protest, but the look on his face stopped her. It wasn't charity. It was reverence. She nodded, eyes glinting. "Only if you promise not to order anything I can't pronounce." He smiled. "Deal." They lingered in the hallway a few minutes longer, as if neither of them wanted to disturb the weight of the moment. Denzel leaned casually against the wall, hands in his coat pockets, while Mrs. Brooks returned to adjusting a mop handle that didn't really need adjusting. He could tell she was trying to gather herself, to process seeing someone she once helped build from the shadows, now standing in front of her, fully formed, deeply grateful. Her eyes shimmered, but she blinked quickly, unwilling to let the tears fall without permission. He knew that kind of strength. It was the kind that didn't ask to be seen, but always was. Denzel finally broke the silence with a question that carried more than words. "You free tonight?" She looked up, startled at first, then softened. "What's tonight?" she asked, more out of habit than curiosity. He smiled. "Just dinner. Conversation. Nothing fancy, unless you count soul food and old stories as fancy." She chuckled, but there was hesitation in her face. Not because she didn't want to go, but because she wasn't used to being invited anywhere just for who she was, especially by someone the world had crowned, but who never forgot the people holding the base. "I've got some meetings," he added quickly, "but none more important than this." She squinted at him as if testing whether he meant it, and in his eyes, she found no performance, just truth. Slowly, she nodded. "All right, but I picked the spot." He grinned. "That's fair." A beat passed, then she smirked. "And I swear if you try to pick me up in a limo, I'll walk right back inside." That made him laugh out loud. "No limos. Just me, you, and some cornbread." She shook her head but couldn't hide the smile stretching across her face. As they parted ways for the day, something unspoken hung in the air between them, a kind of acknowledgement that what they shared wasn't just memory. It was legacy. Denzel walked out into the cold, the sky now overcast, but inside he felt a strange warmth rising. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was purpose. He wasn't done yet. He had more to say, more to give. And he had no intention of letting that moment be a passing sentiment. Mrs. Brooks watched him go from the front window, wiping her hands on a cloth she didn't need. Her heart thudded with a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. He had remembered, not just her face but her spirit, and more than that he had seen through the years, the labor, the invisibility. She wasn't just a footnote in his story, she was a cornerstone. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, she wouldn't be going home to silence. She'd be walking into a room where someone listened. That night wasn't about reunion. It was about restoration, about honoring things that most people pass by. And as Denzel sat in the back seat of a modest black SUV, not a limo, just like she asked, he stared at the restaurant address she had texted him, a little place in the Bronx. No website, no reviews. But he knew the food would be good, and the conversation even better, because this time it was her story that deserved the spotlight. The restaurant was small, tucked between a laundromat and a corner store. Its sign faded but still proud. Inside, the lighting was warm, the tables close together, and the scent of fried okra and collard greens lingered in the air like a welcome home. Mrs. Brooks arrived right on time, wearing a simple beige coat and a scarf that had clearly been hand-knit, maybe by her or someone long gone. Denzel stood as she entered, holding out her chair without saying a word. She nodded in approval, quiet, amused but deeply touched. They didn't need menus. She ordered catfish and sweet tea without hesitation. He followed her lead. The waiter didn't recognize him, and that was a relief. For the first time in a long while, he could just be Denzel, not the actor, not the award winner. Just the boy who used to forget his lines and choke on fear. As their plates arrived, something unspoken passed between them. This was more than dinner. This was a return to origin, a reclamation of things never properly named. She told stories he had forgotten, like the time she found him backstage, tears streaming down his face after he froze during a monologue. "You were ready to quit," she said, shaking her head. "But I gave you that peppermint, remember? Said it was magic. You believed me." He laughed, remembering how that little candy seemed to turn him into a different person. "Maybe it was magic," he said. "Or maybe it was you." She smiled softly, sipping her tea like it was holy. He shared memories too, about how she used to sweep the stage steps before his rehearsals, how she'd leave the lights on just a bit longer, saying it was for safety, though they both knew it was really, so he didn't have to rehearse in the dark. "I noticed," he said quietly. "Even back then. I just didn't know how to say thank you." She looked down, wiping the edge of her plate with a biscuit. "You just did, baby. You just did." For over an hour, time bent around them. Other diners came and went, but the two of them stayed rooted in that booth, trading pieces of the past like treasures pulled from a forgotten chest. There were long pauses, but never awkward ones, just moments where the silence spoke louder than anything else. He watched her hands as she talked, the same hands that used to scrub floors before sunrise, and now they cradled stories with more weight than any golden statue he'd ever held. As the night came to a close, Denzel found himself staring at her across the table, heart heavy but clear. This wasn't just a walk down memory lane, this was revelation. He was beginning to understand something that had always been just out of reach. Greatness doesn't happen in isolation. It grows in the shadow of those who clear the way. And now, sitting across from the woman who once quietly lit his path, he felt something shift inside him, the kind of shift that doesn't let you walk away unchanged. As the plates were cleared, and the last sips of sweet tea settled between them, Denzel leaned in slightly, voice soft but direct. "Why are you still working?" he asked. No judgment, no pity. Just a sincere question from someone who couldn't reconcile the strength he saw with the burden she still carried. Mrs. Brooks didn't answer right away. She looked out the window beside them, watching cars pass under streetlights. Then slowly she turned back, eyes calm. "Because these halls still carry voices," she said, "and I still hear them." She wasn't talking about ghosts or nostalgia. She was talking about purpose. "Every time I sweep a floor, I remember the kids who walked it, the ones who didn't know where else to go. Some made it. Some didn't. But while I'm there, I remember their names, their laughter, their pain." Her voice didn't shake, but it carried weight. Decades of carrying dreams that weren't hers, but felt just as important. "It keeps me going," she added, "like my own kind of prayer." Denzel swallowed hard. The room suddenly felt warmer, tighter. "And retirement?" he asked gently. She smiled, slow and tired. "I never fit in my pocket." Then she added, "or my bones." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a kind of peace forged from acceptance. You don't stop needing money just because your hair turns grey, but more than that. She paused, looking directly at him. You don't stop needing to matter. The words hit him like a stone to the chest. How many people like her walked through life holding the weight of others, while quietly being forgotten? She shifted in her seat, her expression softening. "I ain't mad about it," she said. "This was always the deal. You help, and you hope somebody remembers you were there." Her eyes didn't accuse, they simply spoke truth. "But I never did it to be remembered. I did it 'cause somebody had to." She looked down at her folded hands. "And sometimes I liked being invisible. It let me see things more clearly." Denzel felt something twist inside him. He'd spent years under the spotlight, but she had spent decades making sure that light even turned on. The silence between them deepened, heavy but respectful. Denzel looked at her and saw not just a janitor, not even just a mentor. He saw a pillar that had held up generations without ever asking to be seen, a woman who gave without being asked, stayed when others left, and bore the weight of dreams with nothing more than a quiet presence and a strong back. And now, even as time tried to erase her, she stood steady, cleaning the corners the world forgot. He realized then, this wasn't about charity. It wasn't about sympathy. It was about justice, about giving back a fraction of what had been given in silence. That night, as he walked her to a cab and hugged her goodbye, something had already started forming in his mind. Something big, something long overdue. He didn't say much, just opened the door for her and whispered, "You matter, more than you'll ever know." She nodded once. "I know, baby. I see it now in your eyes." That night, back at his hotel, Denzel didn't turn on the TV. He didn't call room service. He sat in the armchair by the window, still wearing his coat, staring out at the lights of the Bronx like they held answers. His mind was racing, not with lines from scripts or production notes, but with everything Mrs. Brooks had said. The way she still walked those hallways, the way she remembered names no one else did, and the way she quietly accepted being invisible for the sake of others. It wasn't right, not anymore. He reached for his phone and scrolled through contacts until he found the names that mattered: his business manager, his publicist, his foundation director. One by one, he started making calls, calmly, deliberately, not out of impulse but out of conviction. He didn't need permission, he needed action. "It's not charity," he said to one of them. "It's justice. I'm not doing this to feel good. I'm doing this because it should have been done a long time ago." His voice was steady, focused, unshakable. For the next several hours he stayed up reviewing plans. He asked about setting up a fund, about long-term care, about legal paperwork, tax implications, how to do this the right way, not flashy, not performative, just real, effective, permanent. By the time the sun began to rise, he had already spoken with the principal of the high school and proposed an idea, a celebration disguised as a routine event. Something that wouldn't tip her off, but would allow the entire school to finally see her the way he always had. The details came together quickly. He would cover every cost, but the school would host the event, making it feel organic, part of the calendar. Teachers were informed, students were invited, and the staff was told only what they needed to know, that there would be a small ceremony for faculty and alumni. Nothing major, just a little appreciation. The real surprise would come later when Mrs. Brooks stepped into the room expecting to mop the floors afterward, not to stand at the center of it all. Throughout the planning, Denzel was meticulous. Not because he needed control, but because this mattered. This wasn't just a gesture, it was a correction, a rewriting of how things should have been from the start. "She doesn't need praise," he told his assistant. "She needs peace, and that peace comes from knowing someone saw her." The team moved quickly, fueled by his urgency, but under it all there was reverence. No one asked questions. No one tried to scale it back. They knew what this was. It wasn't about headlines, it wasn't about optics, it was about her, a woman who had given her entire life to lifting others while remaining unseen. And now, for the first time, someone had the power and the heart to shine a light back on her. Denzel looked at the final draft of the invitation before hitting send. The subject line read, "Honoring the foundation we all walked on." And with that, the wheels were in motion, not for a performance, but for a moment of truth. 2 weeks later, the school buzzed with quiet curiosity. Students exchanged whispers in the hallways, teachers wore cryptic smiles, and custodians made sure everything was spotless. A flyer had gone up about a routine appreciation ceremony in the auditorium, scheduled for mid-morning. Mrs. Brooks, as always, was the first to arrive. She pushed her cart through the corridors, unaware that this day was anything but routine. She had been told she'd need to tidy up after the event. Just another task, just another morning. When she reached the auditorium, she paused at the door. It was cracked open just slightly, and soft jazz floated out, a tune she hadn't heard in years but somehow recognized. Something felt off. She nudged the door wider and stepped inside. The room was full. Faculty, students, alumni, all seated, all facing the stage. At the center stood Denzel, holding a folded paper. Above him, a banner stretched across the wall in gold letters, "To the one who cleared the way for all of us." She stood frozen. A hand gently guided her toward the front row, but her feet moved like they didn't belong to her. All eyes followed her, but not with the usual indifference she was used to. This was different. She saw respect, recognition, and confusion, because no one ever expected the janitor to be the reason for a standing ovation. Eloise sat slowly, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, but her eyes locked onto his. Denzel unfolded the paper and began to speak. His voice was calm but filled with weight. "She saw me when no one else did," he said. "She gave me warmth when I was cold. Left doors open when I had nowhere to go. And she believed in me before I even understood who I was." He paused and looked at her. "Today, we return just a piece of that." Then he turned to the audience. "We're establishing a full retirement fund in her name. Health care for life. And the school will honor her legacy permanently, with a mural at the entrance so no one forgets who really built this place. And if this story is touching something in you, if it reminds you of someone who lifted you in silence, don't let that feeling pass. Leave a comment below and tell us about that person. Let them be seen, even if it's just through your words. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, about dignity, justice, and people who made a difference without asking for praise, hit the like button. It's a simple act, but it helps more people hear their voices. And if you're someone who values truth, empathy, and second chances, consider subscribing. We tell stories that shine light on those who've lived too long in the shadows. As the applause swelled around her, Mrs. Brooks sat completely still. Her hands trembled in her lap. She didn't cry openly. She never had. But her eyes shone, and her chest rose and fell with deep, careful breaths. She looked around the room and saw a new generation finally looking back. The students who once walked past her without a word were now clapping with purpose. The teachers who never asked her name now nodded in silent admiration. The school had changed, but more importantly, so had its gaze. And in that moment, she didn't need to stand on stage. She didn't need a microphone. The recognition wasn't about noise. It was about stillness, presence, and justice finally arriving in the simplest, most profound way, by being seen. She placed her hand over her heart and nodded at Denzel. He nodded back, lips pressed, eyes misty. For a few seconds, neither said a word, and yet it was the loudest conversation they'd ever had. Denzel stood on stage, the applause still echoing in his ears, but his focus was on her, on Mrs. Brooks seated in the front row, her back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. He didn't rush. He let the silence settle again before speaking. "You all know my name," he began, his voice steady. "You've seen the movies, the speeches, the interviews. But what you don't know is who helped carry me before any of that was real." He held up the envelope in his hand, then looked at it like it held more than paper. "This is just paper. But what she gave me, what she gave so many of us, was the ground beneath our feet." He took a slow breath. "She didn't teach in a classroom. She didn't coach a team. But she showed up every day before the rest of us, made sure the lights were on, and the hallways were clean. And sometimes when no one was watching, she left the doors unlocked. so some kid could practice becoming something he didn't believe he could be yet. A few students in the crowd lowered their heads, visibly moved. Teachers exchanged glances, some blinking back tears. Denzel's voice didn't waver. She wasn't just cleaning. She was making space for people to dream. He stepped down from the stage and walked toward her, his shoes barely making a sound on the floor. When he reached her, he knelt beside her seat, not in show, but in respect. "You saved me, Mrs. Brooks," he said, just loud enough for the room to hear. "And you didn't even know it." Her lips trembled, and for a moment she looked like she might try to speak, but no words came, just a long, slow exhale and a hand placed gently over his. The room was silent again, not out of discomfort, but reverence. He stood and turned to face the audience once more. "This isn't a tribute," he said. "It's a correction. It's a reminder that there are people walking among us who build empires quietly, who shape futures from the shadows, and too often we forget to look back and say, 'We see you.'" He motioned toward the easel holding her portrait and the framed plaque with her name. "This isn't for the media, it's not for the headlines, it's for her. And it's for every unseen soul who's ever made someone else's light possible." The room erupted again in applause, but this time it was different, deeper, fuller. It wasn't just admiration, it was collective recognition, a shift in the atmosphere, the kind of moment that rewires how people see the world, even if just a little. As Denzel stepped back toward the wings of the stage, he caught a glimpse of the principal wiping his face with a handkerchief, and several students rising to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. The mural hadn't even been revealed yet. But already, her presence was larger than ever, and through it all, Mrs. Brooks sat quietly, the center of a moment she never asked for, but had always deserved. Her legacy was no longer hidden in the corners of the school. It was now carved into its history. As she looked around, her eyes didn't seek validation. They sought peace. And for the first time in decades, she found it, in a room full of people who finally saw what had always been right in front of them. Weeks later, the school unveiled the mural in a quiet ceremony with no cameras, no press, just students, staff, and alumni gathered in the front lobby. The wall had been freshly painted, the smell of lacquer still lingering in the air. A large velvet cloth covered the piece. Everyone knew what it was about, but no one had seen it yet. Mrs. Brooks had tried to protest. "I don't need my face on a wall," she'd said, but Denzel had simply replied, "It's not about your face, it's about your presence." When the cloth dropped, the room fell silent. The mural didn't show her mopping floors or pushing her cart. It showed an elderly woman, recognizably her, standing in the shadows of a theater stage, holding a bucket in one hand and watching a young boy rehearse under a single spotlight. The boy's back was to the viewer, but it was clearly a younger Denzel, his posture full of hope and fear. The woman didn't smile, she didn't speak. She just watched, making sure the light stayed on. At the top, in bold letters, a quote stretched across the width of the wall. "Not every hero takes the stage. Some stay behind the curtain to keep the lights burning." Students stared, unmoving. Teachers leaned in closer. One whispered, "That's her." Another, "I never knew." It wasn't just art. It was a shift, the kind that rewires memory and carves new meaning into old spaces. For the first time, the entryway to the school didn't honor a principal or a donor. It honored someone who'd worked in silence. Mrs. Brooks stood beside Denzel, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't say much, just nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "It's beautiful," she finally whispered. "Too much, maybe, but beautiful." Denzel smiled. "It's the bare minimum," he said. "You deserved more." A few students approached her after, not sure what to say. One offered a hug. Another simply said, "Thank you." She received it all with quiet grace, her shoulders a little straighter than before. The mural became more than decoration. It became a ritual. Students began touching the edge of the wall for good luck before performances. New teachers were told her story on their first day, and over time something subtle changed. People greeted the janitorial staff with eye contact, with respect. "Good morning, ma'am," became a common sound in the hallway, not because they were told to, but because they had seen what respect looked like when it was finally painted on a wall. And still, Mrs. Brooks kept working for a little while longer. She said she'd go when it felt right. She still enjoyed walking the halls, still found comfort in the rhythm of the mop against tile. But now, something was different. When she moved through the building, people stepped aside, not in avoidance but in reverence, as if they understood they were in the presence of someone who had shaped the very ground beneath their feet. The ripple effect of the ceremony didn't fade, it deepened. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the air at the school. Students who used to barrel down hallways with earbuds in now slowed down when passing Mrs. Brooks. "Good morning, ma'am," became more common than hallway chatter. Some even began asking if she needed help carrying supplies, something she always politely declined, but appreciated. It wasn't politeness for show anymore. It was acknowledgement. Teachers who had barely known her name before now greeted her with warmth. One young math teacher, new to the staff, confessed he had never thought about who opened the classrooms before he arrived. "But now," he said during a staff meeting, "I make it a point to say her name first each day." Others nodded. Change was subtle, but real. Respect had become visible, not forced but earned, through the revelation of a woman's quiet impact. Eloise didn't seek attention, and that never changed. She still kept her pace slow, still preferred to listen more than speak. But there was a softness in her eyes now that hadn't been there before, a kind of peace. She no longer moved through the building like a ghost in the background. She moved like someone who had been restored to her rightful place, still humble, but no longer hidden. For many students, the greatest lesson that semester didn't come from textbooks, it came from her. A group of seniors even started a legacy project, interviewing long-time school staff to collect stories for a school archive. When they asked Mrs. Brooks to be the first, she laughed. "Child, you sure you want to start with me?" But she agreed. Her stories weren't dramatic, they were honest. Stories of long nights, scraped knees, and kids who didn't know how to say thank you back then, but had found their way to say it now. Through that project, new generations began to understand that legacy doesn't always look like medals. It often looks like mop buckets. The mural became a kind of pilgrimage. Students took photos in front of it, graduation day selfies, choir group shots. Theatre kids would nod toward it before rehearsals like a ritual of gratitude. And with each passing week, Mrs. Brooks's presence became more than just symbolic. It became formative. She was a living legend, not because of what she said, but because of what she embodied: discipline, consistency, grace, and invisible power. By spring, it was clear. Something fundamental had changed. This wasn't just a school with better manners. It was a school with better memory. A place that had finally learned how to see the people who made its success possible. And at the center of that shift was one woman, in blue, walking the same halls she always had. But this time no longer unnoticed. The story didn't stay confined to the school walls. Within days, word began to spread, first through whispers in the community, then through posts on social media, and eventually in emails from journalists requesting interviews. News outlets reached out, eager to frame the moment into a headline: "Denzel honors his high school janitor." But every request was met with a simple, quiet no. Denzel wasn't interested in making this about himself. He had no desire to retell what the mural had already said better than words ever could. When his publicist called to say one major network wanted an exclusive sit-down, he replied without hesitation, "This isn't a PR story, it's a life story, and the only one who should be telling it is her." He wasn't being distant, he was being intentional. For decades, Denzel had lived in the glow of the spotlight, but he knew exactly when to step out of it. This wasn't about redemption for him, it was about restoration for her. He'd already said everything he needed to say, in front of the people who mattered. At a small charity event the following week, someone asked him offhand, "Why didn't you go public with what you did?" Denzel paused, looked at the man for a long moment, then said, "Because she never asked for the world to look at her, just for it to stop looking past her." The room went quiet. The message landed harder than any headline could have. He wasn't seeking praise. He was protecting purity, and he knew that once the cameras came in, the story would no longer belong to Mrs. Brooks. It would belong to the narrative machine. He sent a single quote to the school's newsletter when they asked for a statement. Just a few lines. She didn't sweep floors. She protected dreams. She held a space for kids like me to become who we were meant to be. I didn't give her anything. I just returned what never should have been taken: rest, respect, and peace. No hashtag, no website link, just words carved from truth. The newsletter printed it next to a photo of Mrs. Brooks beside the mural, smiling gently, eyes lowered. For the school community, that quote became something of a mantra. Teachers printed it and hung it in their classrooms. Students began repeating parts of it during discussions. She protected dreams found its way into graduation speeches and hallway graffiti. And all of it, every echo of that sentiment, only deepened the impact. Mrs. Brooks didn't need to speak much. The world had started speaking for her for once, in a language she could finally believe. And through it all, Denzel remained in the background. Watching, supporting, quiet. It wasn't detachment. It was reverence. He had made peace with the part he'd played, and now it was time to let the legacy live where it belonged, not on stages, not on screens, but in hearts, in hallway murals, in morning greetings, and in the quiet dignity of a woman who had always known her worth, even when no one else had. The day Mrs. Brooks retired, there were no balloons, no big party. That was her request. "I've already had my moment," she told the principal. "Now I just want to go home in peace." But she didn't leave without a trace. On her final morning, she made one last quiet walk through the halls, pausing by classrooms, nodding at portraits, letting her fingers run lightly along the lockers. Her cart stayed in the supply room. She wasn't cleaning, she was remembering, and saying goodbye her way. Before she left, she stopped in front of the mural. No one else was around. She stood in silence for nearly a minute, looking not at herself, but at the boy in the spotlight. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a small note, neatly folded and slightly worn. She stuck it just beneath the frame, tucking it in with care. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked out the front doors, her steps slow, but full of peace. She never looked back. Later that afternoon, Denzel returned to the school one last time. He hadn't planned to visit that day, but something in him pulled him there. A custodian mentioned a note on the mural, so he went to read it. It was written in her careful script, no bigger than a receipt, and said, "You don't need to be remembered by many, just by someone you helped find their way." He smiled, quietly, no performance, no tears, just a deep, personal exhale, as if a chapter had closed, not with a bang, but with a blessing. He folded the note and placed it gently in his coat pocket. Not for publicity, not for history. Just for himself, because sometimes the most valuable things we carry aren't trophies or titles, but moments like this. Proof that the greatest impacts are made without fanfare, that real heroes rarely wear capes, and often wear name tags instead. He looked at the mural once more, then whispered under his breath, "Thank you, schoolmum," and left the building, sunlight brushing the side of his face like a curtain closing. From that day forward, her absence was felt, but never in a way that hurt. The school didn't feel emptier. It felt fuller, like her presence had finally spread into the walls themselves. Her name lived in the mural, in the whispers of students before shows, in the way people now treated one another. She hadn't just cleaned a school, she had cleaned a lens, and now everyone could finally see, clearly, truthfully. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with noise, it comes with silence, with dignity, with a life that lifted others without ever asking to be lifted in return. And when that kind of soul walks away, you don't chase after them. You carry their example forward quietly, but forever. Mrs. Brooks never asked for attention. She never sought praise. She just showed up, every day, for 47 years. And in the end, it wasn't a headline that honored her. It was a single moment of being seen. This story isn't just about a janitor or a movie star. It's about how dignity can live in silence, how the most powerful people in our lives are often the ones we never thought to thank, until it's almost too late. What about you? Who was that person in your life? The one who helped you behind the scenes without ever asking for credit? Share it in the comments. Let their name live even in the smallest way. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Subscribe for more real stories that shine light on the people who've been in the shadows for too long. And next time, you'll meet someone else who was underestimated until the world saw what they were really made of.